Hi, welcome to the Newbery Chronicles, where we read through the Newbery Medal winners one book at a time. I'm Michael,
And I'm Rebecca.
and this time, in our first official episode after our introductory episode, we are talking about 1963's Newbery Medal winner, A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. So, Rebecca, give us an overview of what this book is.
Yeah, so before I do the overview, I do just want to say Michael and I picked this book because we tried to pick a book that we both were familiar with. Just something we had visited frequently in our childhood, one that we had both read. So that's why we picked this one first for our first official book to read and discuss.
You might also hear the dishwasher behind us. Our kids just went to sleep, so hopefully you don't hear any children. But last time we also had a dishwasher running behind us, so this may just be like the default ambient background of our podcast.
We'll just see if that's an ongoing theme. So Wrinkle in Time. It was published in 1962. Won the Newbery Award in 1963. So this was a book that Madeleine L'Engle had tried to get published, I think, 20-something times before it finally took. And so turns out people didn't know what to do with it. Some said it was it wasn't an adult book, but it wasn't a children's book, so they didn't really know what to do with it. Madeleine L'Engle had a theory that it took so long to get published because it had a female protagonist in a science fiction novel, which at the time was very uncommon. Wrinkle in Time. Funny story, she ended up getting it published because she threw a tea party for her mom around Christmas time, and a publisher was there at the party, and they pitched the idea, and he published it. So that was exciting. So the plot of Wrinkle in Time. So
The one that was so hard, the plot that got canceled by 26 publishers.
Right. So Wrinkle in Time follows the story of the Murray family. Meg Murray is the protagonist. So her father has been on a government mission, I guess you'd say, for how many years?
I think it's been months. He's an astrophysicist, like an experimental astrophysicist,
It can't
right?
have been months because Charles Wallace was a baby when he left.
Okay, it's been a while. It's been a while.
He's been gone for a while, and they've lost contact with him, but they don't think he's dead, and the whole town kind of like sticks up their noses at the Murrays because they're weird. Michael and I both said that this family gives off very homeschool vibes, like the kids.
Yeah, if homeschooling had been more of a thing in the 1960s.
Right. But the mom is apparently really hot. So
they make a point of saying that many, many times in this book, which is weird. Also, Meg is not hot. We were also told many times.
She is not hot, but she's got her strengths. She's also got her faults, which ends up saving the family. Dad has been missing for a while on a government mission. And then there are three, I guess you'd say, celestial beings that show up, Mrs. Witch, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Whatsit, to help Meg and her brother Charles Wallace, and then their homie Calvin O'Keefe.
Who honestly doesn't do a lot in this book, but hold Meg's hand. I mean, as unhot as Meg allegedly is, he seems very into her.
Very handsy. So anyway, these three celestial beings show up to help Meg and Charles Wallace and Calvin learn where her father is and bring him home to safety. So the whole book is really a journey with the theme of good versus evil, and the evil in this book is really sameness, I'd say. They're fighting the darkness. What do they call it? The dark thing, the black thing?
Yeah, there's this. It's hard to. One of the reasons why I imagine this book is hard to describe is that it's really difficult to do like the book jacket summary of it, because it will just go in these really bizarre directions that you wouldn't see coming. For the first couple chapters, they're in their home in, is it Connecticut? Is that where they're upstate New York maybe, or somewhere East Coast but rural. and just strange things are happening, and these celestial beings are coming, but they look like old women.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, like literally all of a sudden, they're on another planet, like with very little warning. And then on this other planet, the celestial beings turn into like centaurs that can fly, basically. And then they go to this like 2-dimensional planet for like half a second, and then like, so there's a lot of stuff that happens in here that's hard to describe.
Yeah, but the big overall thing that's going on is this darkness, this evil thing is taking over the universe. And there's one planet that is given in, and that's Camazotz, and that's where Meg's dad is. So they go to Camazotz, and everyone follows a very particular rhythm to their life that is literally identical. And if anyone diverts from that, then there's punishment. And then it is the one that's controlling Camazotz.
Which is like a giant brain. It's really just like the giant brain that's like pulsing. Like it sounds like everyone is in a club the whole time, because there's just like this like they say that there's like this beat, like this pulse that goes through the planet, and everyone just like follows the rhythm of this beat, which emanates from the brain.
So it's like a hellish rave, I guess we would say.
Set in like suburbia.
Yes. And so what ends up happening is they find Meg's dad, and then I guess, are we giving spoilers?
I mean, at this point, this is 2/3 of the way into the book,
so we'll just go for it.
Spoiler warning for those who don't want the last third of the book.
Yeah, and so Charles Wallace is a young kid, but he is a genius, and he and Meg have a really special connection. But he's clearly I mean, for lack of a better word, he's the brain of the family. One of the brains. There's many brains. But he thinks that he can get in its mind and be able to understand it and come out of it and help to save everything. But what ends up happening is he becomes controlled by it until Meg comes back and is able to love him and connect with him with that interpersonal love that it can understand, and that's how she rescues him.
Right, because it is so mechanical and like rational, like so like the whole book, it's like this whole family of brainiacs, right? The mother is like a award-winning like biologist, really sexy biologist, and the father is of course like this like government-employed astrophysicist, and Charles Wallace is like this like savant, like child prodigy sort of thing.
That the rest of the town thinks is like dumb, I guess, because he doesn't speak outside of the family. Like, it took him a while to talk, but when he did, he was just saying brilliant things.
But the whole book, she's been thinking like, well, I'm not as smart as all these people. I'm not as hot as my mom. I'm not like these other people. She has trouble at school and things like that. I mean, she's clearly very intelligent. And so, like, it's just in the context of the family that she doesn't feel like she measures up. But then, like, it turns out that she can love people. And
part of it, too, is that the Mrs. Witch and Mrs. Who and Mrs. Whatsit, those celestial beings we were talking about, tell her that the gift that they give her is her faults. Like, use her faults. And they will work to her advantage. And so those faults are really just her stubbornness and her tenacity and her just unwillingness to give in, which ends up allowing her to go back to Charles Wallace when everyone had kind of given up hope and build that connection with him again. So, so this book is part of a 5-book series, which Michael and I found out from our research in the back of this book, is that it's actually part of, like, I guess 2 series or 3 series?
Well, it turns out, something I didn't know reading this book as a kid is that, like, because I didn't read very many of Madeleine L'Engle's books, but apparently, like, most of the novels that Madeleine L'Engle wrote are in some way connected to the characters that appear in A Wrinkle in Time. And the back of the book says it's part of a quintet, the Time Quintet, but if you go to the index in the back of the book, that has the full like table of her novels and how they connect to one another. It turns out that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There are 14 books that she wrote that in some way connect to A Wrinkle in Time and take place in the same universe, and some of which share characters.
Yeah.
So this is not always the case with other Newbery Medal winners, but luckily this is the first in the series. There'll be other Newbery Award winners that are like the fourth or fifth books in series, and I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But
yeah. So, yeah, that's A Wrinkle in Time. Is there anything else synopsis-wise we should talk about?
I don't think so. I mean, the big thing, the reason why it's called A Wrinkle in Time is basically there's this concept, which is like a theoretically real concept, which is that like in order to travel long distances to get to interstellar planets, like you can either take like hundreds of thousands of years that would take like, you know, to travel in a rocket ship to go to another solar system, or you can do what they do in this book, which is that you can bend space to make the actual linear distance that you travel a lot smaller. And so that is, they call it a tesseract. And I don't know if that's a phrase that Madeleine L'Engle wrote or not. One of the things that's tricky about her books is she mixes like concepts that she invents with like what were at the time like experimental like vanguard ideas in science.
Which I think is really cool.
It is really cool. In the sequel, for instance, there's a lot of talk of mitochondria, but there's also this talk of like farandulae, which farandulae she invented, but when I read that as a kid, I didn't know that she invented that, and so I thought that farandulae were also part of cells in the same way that mitochondria are until I got to biology. But anyway, there's also, they do the same thing with time at the end of the book where it's like as if they've not been gone on this other planet for very long. So they've like bent time so that they can have not actually spent that much time away from their home.
Right.
One of the things that we want to do with each book is, if we've read them before, kind of give our memories of the book and how we remember encountering it as a kid, and then explaining how we feel now as adults reading this. A lot of these books we've not read before, but in the case of A Wrinkle in Time, both Rebecca and I have read it. So I guess we'll start there. So my memory of the book is, I remember reading it, I must have been like 10 or 11 or something. I remember the house that I lived in when I read it. And it was when I was, like, we moved into the house when I was 9 and we left it when I was 12. So it was somewhere in that range. And I remember reading it. My dad, it was one of the books I mentioned, I think in the introductory episode, that a lot of my early childhood reading was recommended by my parents. And this is a book that we had around the house for some reason. It was not a book that it was not the copy my parents had read. But it was an old copy of A Wrinkle in Time. My dad recommended that I read it, and I did, and I remember really liking it. And I think that like a lot of children, especially like the kind of children who like read books because their parents suggest it, and you know, you're kind of like bookish kid who's not very social or whatever. Like I remember really connecting with Meg, and like the fact that she doesn't know how to connect to other people, and she feels like not part of, you know, the cool kids club or whatever, which we should mention. One thing you didn't mention is she has two extremely normie, like jock twin brothers who are also brilliant, but they're like actually good at being part of society rather than being just like genius iconoclasts like the rest of her family. And that's a tension in the book too. But anyway, so like I identified with that while also like, you know, I think that there's like a genre of children's literature that is like really like Ender's Game or like different things like that is really like congratulatory of children who are precocious. And this book is definitely that, where there's a lot of like, oh, you know, these kids have a knowledge, like these kids know more than their peers, and the reason they don't fit in is because they're so smart. Even Meg, like, she's like bored in school. That's like one of her problems, and she can like do math really well.
But not the way that they want her to do it.
Right, exactly. Which is like part of the whole like conformity, like versus like, you know, unique identity sort of thing the book is doing. But I think that also like that really appeals to children, especially children who like me, like got really good grades and were kind of like precocious in certain ways, and that can be like really like, you know, oh wow, this book gets me, you know, that sort of thing. And I remember having that feeling. I also remember it just being cool. Like I don't know how much science fiction I'd read at the time, but I'd read enough that I was like, I knew that I liked that sort of thing. I don't think that I had read a lot of like the really mystical, strange science fiction that this is doing, which like, I mean, this book came out in the early 60s, and like, if you read science fiction from the 1960s, it's like part of like a lot of people call it like the new wave of like new wave sci-fi, where it became a lot more experimental and strange. And I don't think that Madeleine L'Engle would identify herself with like some of those authors who were doing like new wave sci-fi, but it kind of feels of the same thing where they're you know you don't get these like square jawed like protagonists who are like through logic and reason going to like solve these problems. It's a lot stranger, and I remember that being really cool and striking. I also remember thinking it was cool that it talks about Jesus, because at one point like it talks about the like all the warriors of light who are fighting the darkness, and like there's a lot of like quoting of Bible verses and things like this in the book, and they talk about how Jesus and I think the Buddha or something like that, or Gandhi maybe, are like all warriors for light. And I remember thinking like it was cool that I felt like it was incorporating stuff from like Christianity, you know, which, you know,
yeah, they have scripture in there too.
Right. So those are what I remember. I read this book several times as a kid, and this is my first time since I was probably a teenager reading it. But I read it a lot growing up, probably like half a dozen times. This is a favorite of mine. What about you, Rebecca?
Yeah, so I was trying to remember when I read it for the first time. I think that it was in 6th grade. I cannot remember for sure. And I remember really liking it then. And then I revisited it in college when we were actually talking about these books, when we were dating or beginning to date.
I think the copy that we have is from a bookstore from the town, from Jackson, like the town where we went to school.
Yeah, so I reread the quintet, and I don't remember a lot about the other books. But yeah, I loved this book when I was younger. Honestly, a lot of my earliest memories of this are associated with the movie that Disney made, and was it 2003?
Right. Disney has made 2 different movies of this. One in 2018 that has like Chris Pine and like Reese Witherspoon and Oprah in it. But then they made a TV movie.
But we had the VHS at home, and so I watched it quite a bit. Like, I really liked it, which is not...
Hold on, Madeleine L'Engle has a great quote about the movie thing that we found on the Wikipedia page. It was... Oh, man. Keep talking and I'll find it.
So anyway, I loved this movie. Well, I don't know, love's a strong word, but I watched it a lot. And it had Gregory Smith in it, who was in the show I watched at the time was Everwood. And I loved it. He was Ephraim. And so he's Calvin in the movie. Anyway, so a lot
I found the quote. So Madeleine L'Engle is interviewed by Newsweek and asked if the film met her expectations. And she said, and this is a direct quote, "I have glimpsed it. I expected it to be bad, and it is."
Yeah. Well, and yes, it surely. But I enjoyed it. And it's funny because there's like a few actors that were in these, shows that I watched and not a lot of other people watched that were in this movie. So it's just funny to me. Anyway, but I loved this book then, and I still do, which I know we're not there at the time. I'm trying to remember some of my initial impressions. Like, I liked the fantasy of it. I liked, I don't know, I think Camazotz is a really cool, not a cool planet. What happens there is terrible, but I think the imagery of that in the book is really good. So I was pretty fascinated by that. I thought their family was really neat and weird. And it was just sweet that, nobody understood them, but they really understood each other. So I really
It is a very sweet, loving family.
I also remember being really bought into the romance between Meg and Calvin, which we'll get to my impressions about that now later. But anyway, I remember really liking them and their romance. So yeah, those were some of my initial impressions. But I did, even now, as I read this book now, I still pictured the characters as the people in the 2003 movie.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
I can't not, because that's what I watched so much. That's some of my biggest associations, which it's funny that Madeleine L'Engle hated that movie, and that's kind of my...
I think in my mind, it's like a really...
Sorry if you hear that. There's people doing fireworks.
Yeah, we're recording this on Memorial Day, and our neighborhood always goes all out with fireworks.
They celebrate everything, so...
But, I don't know, it's a weird It's funny that it's been adapted twice into movies because this is a book that strikes me as really difficult to adapt just because of how strange it is and it's not conventionally structured.
Yeah.
And like I don't know, it is weird. And I guess like Disney must own the rights since they adapted it twice. Um, and I think I saw the TV movie with you at your house one time, but
Yes.
I've also seen the 2018 version. I will say neither version is good. They're both bad. And I think part of the reason that they're bad is that it's really difficult to understand what to do with this book. And I think that this can get into like how I feel about it now, like having read it for the first time in probably at least 10 years, probably 15 years. Um, and so I still really like it. But I think that like there are things that stand out that are funny. Um, we've already kind of joked about how much it comments on the characters' appearances, specifically Meg and her mom. And there's this one part in the beginning of the book where Meg is like, "I'm just so plain and I'm not very attractive," and her mother's like, "It's okay, I was like that too once, and now look at me, I'm so beautiful." And like,
And Calvin says, like, oh, they're rumoring that your dad is not here because he's run off with some other woman, but how could anyone leave your mother? She's so good looking, basically.
yeah, I
Like,
think what struck me reading it this time is this book is kind of caught between eras, where you have, on the one hand, especially the setup is very like what I imagine like 1940s and 50s like children's literature being, where you have like kind of small town life. You have a like a kind of a fairly traditional family. Granted, the father is absent, but the father wouldn't normally be absent for this family, and the mother does all the cooking and stuff. They're all like very
on her Bunsen burner.
yeah. She's like in her lab, like cooking stew on the Bunsen burner while she does like biological tests or something. It's really wild. And in this book, it makes sense that she's playing both roles because she's a single parent in this book. But in the other books, she still plays those roles, and it's really funny because the dad is there. But so like in some ways, it's a very typical like kind of atomic family sort of thing. Like in some ways, wouldn't feel out of place with like what like Henry Huggins, like Beverly Cleary, that sort of thing, where you have these kind of like precocious kids who are like just ride their bikes places, they go to school, like white picket fence sort of thing. And then the other thing is this book is like really mystical and high minded in a way that like Rebecca mentioned, like it had trouble being published, and I think part of the reason it had trouble being published is like it's like quite frankly like psychedelic, like early 60s. Like I don't think like Madeleine L'Engle was like doing LSD or whatever, but it like kind of anticipates like how a lot of fantasy and science fiction literature would be in the next like couple of decades, where it's like mind bending and like really focused on high-minded ideas, and like also really focused on Madeleine L'Engle's religious preoccupations, which she's an Episcopalian, but she's also like a Universalist, which I guess is not like a given among Episcopals. So she like incorporates a lot of elements of like her faith in there, which is like really ambitious and strange, as well as incorporating a lot of like scientific ideas as well. And so like you have on the one hand like a book that feels very old-fashioned in some ways, especially how it like introduces its characters, but also by the end feels like very visionary. And I think that like visionary in a way that a lot of books aren't, like even young adult books, like a lot of young adult books and a lot of children's books have this theme of like be yourself, don't conform to everybody. Like that's so common nowadays. I think like maybe A Wrinkle in Time was like innovating that in some ways, because I think that conformity was much more of a value maybe in earlier decades. But like now it's like boilerplate, like everything, like every children's media everywhere is like live your dreams, don't let anyone tell you not to be who you are, or like whatever. But like the specific ways that it goes about it are really interesting, because I think it is like, and this is me like coming at it from like me as an adult, like looking back, like is coming at it from a very specific point in time in which American life was changing, and is responding to that change in a very specific way that I think, and a very cerebral way that's often not engaged with on this level in like a lot of YA literature that has like those themes about being yourself and don't conform. Like, because like you had after World War II, the United States um, became very mechanized, right? And the United States had already been industrializing, but after World War II is where you see things like the rise of the suburbs and planned communities. You see like a real emphasis on like conformity and like not like, having dissenting voices and stuff like that. Like there's of course like the Red Scare and that sort of stuff that happens in the 1950s that I'm sure Madeleine L'Engle is responding to on some level. But also just you have like the rise of television as mass media, like which projects like a kind of typical family, the rise of like sitcoms and that sort of thing. Like the concept of the nuclear family is sort of like solidified after World War II. And the idea of like everyone, like mass produced appliances and stuff like that, like everyone has a microwave, everyone like has these certain things in their house, like this sort of mass like consumer conformity. And I think that like there is also this like optimism about science as well, where you have like, wow, we made jets and we can go supersonic and we can do all these things through reason and our science. We made the atomic bomb, and a lot of the science fiction of like the 1940s and 50s is very utopian and visionary, where you're going to have like society that is like under the rule of reason and law and science, and that will be like amazing. And I think Madeleine L'Engle in this book is really expressing a lot of anxiety about that, because you have like a planet like Camazotz in which that is like come to be. Like it is like the American suburbs where everyone has the same things. Everyone is kind of like your upper middle class, like wealthy folks, all doing the same things all at the same time. And that is portrayed to be like this evil that like robs humanity of its essence. And I think that like the climax in which like Meg has to save Charles Wallace from like, and like Charles Wallace is like a brilliant person, or her dad, a scientist, is like caught up in this web of that, like because they think that they are smart enough to engage with this. But to be smart is simply to like play into like the conformity, because all this conformity was able to happen because of scientific advancements that allowed for this highly mechanized society. And like love is something that doesn't necessarily fit into that. And the idea that she can save Charles Wallace with love, and love is the one thing that like conformity and like this like mechanized society can't understand or make room for. I think that's really interesting. And I mean, like, love is the answer in so many movies and books and stuff, but the way in which it's deployed in this book is like really interesting and cool. Were you going to say something, Rebecca? I'm sorry. I've been talking for a long time.
I can wait for my turn.
It's your turn. I think okay. That it should be your turn.
Well, I think also building upon that, I also think it's really great how Madeline, I know we were making fun of it a second ago, but like Meg's insecurities about how different she is and how she struggles in school and how she is not as pretty as everyone, which I think everyone has on some level, those insecurities. But for her, it like is creating actual struggles with her to, just make her way through society. And then she's the one that brings her brother and her dad out of this world of like extreme sameness where everyone conforms to the same thing, and everything is supposedly beautiful when it's really evil. I think that is really a great, I don't know, just a great juxtaposition that she makes to just kind of drive that home without it being, I don't know, like on the nose. Like it's not like she ever says like, here's Meg, she was insecure, and that those, she's the one that saves the day. I don't know. I just think she does that really well and seamlessly. I still really also love this book. I think one of my, like reading it now, after I've read all these other things and, now in 2022 as opposed to in the 60s, like it's interesting to me. I think that a lot of, the dystopian YA novel is such a theme right now, or a trend, however you'd say that. Like that's, so many authors are doing that. I thought that when I read this, I thought that tessering sounded a lot like apparating in the Harry Potter world. So I wonder if J.K. Rowling borrowed from her there. I think Camazotz looks like so many other dystopian societies and
Like the Giver is kind of premised on that too. Is like
right.
everyone is the same, and individual identity is
Right.
subservient to like sameness.
Yeah, so I don't know the history of like who did that first or what that looked like and who borrowed what from anybody subconsciously or otherwise. But I enjoyed seeing that now. Like I think now it's easy to compare to those other books of like, well, so and so did it this way. But I think that she does it really well. I wished, I don't know. Part of me wished we had spent more time in Camazotz. Like I think that we got a good feel of what it looks like, but I don't feel like the majority of the book takes place there. But that's definitely
It
where the most
doesn't.
action happens is there. So but it's not a very long book.
It's
So
not. It's like it's under 250 pages, and like I think this is like it's just a really wild book, like a really wild children's book.
she's
In the sense
doing
that
a
it's
lot.
right, she crams so much in here and it's so dense. Like
But it's not, it never feels like, I say I wish we had spent more time in Camazotz, but I don't think the book is like a lesser book because we don't. You know what I mean? Like, I think that she does a lot with what she has, but you're not like lacking. It doesn't seem like she's doing too much.
I
to me.
think I think it's not that she's doing too much, but there are things that like revisiting this as an adult I recognized as like, oh, this is not. I think my mind had filled in stuff as a child, or maybe like as a child I just didn't care about these details. Like for instance, I kind of joked about it earlier, but Calvin is such a nothing character in this book.
Oh, I was about to get to him.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So I don't. That was one thing that I want to say. Like when I was a kid, I was really bought into their romance. So Calvin does this thing that when I was a kid, I thought was like so romantic in books. Like he just leads Meg everywhere and just is very
Yeah, he like grabs her when she's scared and that
all
sort of
the
stuff.
time. But even when she's not scared, like he's just constantly like touching her.
Oh, they do the
But
thing where she
they
takes off her
don't-
glasses and he's like, "You have beautiful
You're
eyes."
beautiful. My gosh, it's like this Princess Diaries moment. I don't know. It's just so silly now. But like the other thing is that he's super super protective. But the thing about the book is they just like jump in. She meets Calvin and he's just automatically that way.
So much
Like,
of the
we're
book is
just supposed
like
to
so
be-
much of the book is like that. It moves so fast. Like
Yeah.
we meet
But we're supposed to be bought into this romance without them ever really calling it a romance. And like half the time they're holding hands and I'm like, is this platonic? Is it not? And then all of a sudden it's not. And
it's
so
not. And by book 3 in this series, they have kids together. So
right. And they end up having 7 kids that they seem to be very happy, which is great for them. But I just like reading it now, I'm like, why are these two in love? Like, why? I mean, they can be
because he's
together.
smart. Like honestly, like
But-
he's precocious and doesn't fit in with his family, and because
Right.
he comes from.
But they could just be friends.
They could be, but I think this is another thing about like the kind of old fashioned element
Yeah.
of the book is that like you have two teenagers who
Right.
are
What are you
like
gonna do with
a
them?
heterosexual couple, and it's like, well, of course they're going to be in love at some point.
Which I mean, I'm glad that they're in love, but I just feel like that. I guess I retract my former statement. I think with them, there's so little time to like build on all these characters, especially with like a romance that you're just starting up. So she doesn't try. It's just like, well, here they are. They both feel, isolated in some ways, so they're in love. But I just thought that like, I mean, Calvin's a good guy, but I was just like, stop touching her. Like, just leave her alone. I don't know. That was kind
Yeah.
of my reaction to him at this point, which, like they definitely build on that relationship in other novels, but I kind of wish like, I don't know. I just didn't feel like it was super necessary for this book.
I think that like honestly, like a lot of the book, and this is one thing that struck me as an adult, and I think this is like one of the appeals of it as a kid, and one of the things that makes it like kind of a special book, especially when you're reading as a kid. But as an adult, I can see like the seams of is because it is so much happens, and because it is fairly short as a book, she just jumps into things, and so like you have that romance that go between Meg and Calvin, but also just like some of the themes. Like I think like very few books would just have the characters stop and say, here's all the big ideas that this book is about. But there's a sequence like not too far into the book, like where you up to that point you've been like, huh, this is kind of weird. What's happening? And all of a sudden they're like, hey, look, we're fighting this thing and we're on the same team as Jesus and Gandhi, so let's go.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of shorthand that where Madeline L'Engle draws on a lot of like mythology and religion to just like shortcut to this big idea.
Yeah.
And I think that's really thrilling, especially as a kid when you've heard those names, like you know who Gandhi is, or you know who Jesus is, or you know you've read the Bible, or you've heard these Bible verses that they say, and you can instantly like plug into, oh, this is the bigger thing that they're talking about. But as an adult, I can kind of see how she's taken shortcuts a little bit, where you would maybe as an adult you might want there to be more nuance and discussion about like the philosophy of like, okay, so what is darkness, what is light, like because Jesus was not fighting against conformity. What does it mean to say that Jesus is a warrior for light? How does that fit in within Christianity? And like she doesn't really do that, but she uses like someone like Jesus to just say, oh, this is important, just like what Jesus did. And so the scale of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So I mean, my impressions now is I still think it's a great book. I do, even having, like I said, read all those other dystopian YA books and Harry Potter and all those things that I think borrowed from her, like I still think her book holds up. So I still really like it.
Yeah, and I still really love the ending. I talked about the ending already, but like the ending where she loves Charles Wallace, and that's the thing that like reason can't understand, and so that's the thing that saves him. Like I think that is just like a really wonderful idea, and that is, I don't know, like that is something that continues to be like a powerful idea regardless of social context. Like as long as we live in a world in which like human life is abstracted into numbers and into formats and into structures, the power of love to kind of like subvert that and re-bestow humanity upon people that systems have taken away from. Like I don't know, that's really beautiful.
Yeah. I also still really like the 2003 movie, so I don't know what that says about me and my opinions, but I still have a very fond memory of that movie, and I will watch it again. So
that movie has at least one fan. So
yeah, but I've not seen the 2018 one.
I don't think it's good.
Okay.
I don't.
Well, I'll just stick with old Ephraim over there.
All right. So am I hearing like thumbs up on Wrinkle in Time? Yeah, we'll try to. I think we'll probably try to do like kind of dumb like Roger Ebert, like thumbs up, thumbs down sort of thing at the end of each one, and just to reduce the beauty of human art into an algorithm, like it in A Wrinkle in Time. So yeah, I'm still thumbs up on this too. I will say, like as a note, I was going to, when I was a kid, I had read through the third book, or what I thought was the third book. So that's like there's A Wrinkle in Time, and then there's the next book, which is called The Wind in the Door, in which they meet like literal cherubim and then go into Charles Wallace's mitochondria or whatever. Like it's really surreal, like even weirder than this book is. And then the third book is called The Swiftly Tilting Planet, in which they use their psychic powers that they've developed over the last two books to go back in time and change the trajectory of history to avert a nuclear apocalypse. And so when we were reading this book, I was like, okay, I'm going to read this book, and I'm actually going to finish the quintet, like the time quintet that is advertised on the back of this book. And that's when I found out, I got through the third book, and that's when I found out that like, oh, there's actually a lot of books connected to this. And I kind of petered out. But having reacquainted myself with the second and third book, which was all I had read as a kid, like I will say this is definitely the strongest one. The others are much weirder, if that's even possible, than A Wrinkle in Time.
I do remember them getting absurd, but I don't remember.
I think absurd is the wrong thing. And like some of the stuff is really cool. Like one of the things that happens at the end of A Wind in the Door is they're inside the mitochondria, and like there's like the book breaks down into poetry. Like it's really stylistically adventurous, like because they're in the mitochondria, and the mitochondria all have to work together, or excuse me, the farandulae inside the mitochondria, whatever. Like it's really convoluted, but like basically it's sort of the same as in A Wrinkle in Time, where the individual components of the mitochondria are splitting up because they want to be individuals and don't want to serve the greater good. And so, like, the thing that brings them back together is this, like, poetry and song. And the book itself breaks down into poetry and song. And that's really interesting and cool. And, like, there's other stuff that happens in A Swiftly Tilting Planet that's also kind of cool like that. And, like, stuff that you would never see in children's literature in general. Like, really visionary stuff. But, like, this is the most coherent of those three books, I think. And the one that falls apart least upon scrutiny. Because I think a lot of times her books have these big ideas, but maybe don't always completely cohere. Like, I imagine, like, she sat down and wrote A Wind at the Door, imagining that ending, and, like, some of the stuff getting to that ending is kind of difficult. But so I don't know how much listeners to this podcast would be interested in reading the other books, or how much listeners have already read those other books. But that's my, like, little capsule review of them, which is that there's some cool stuff, but this is still the best.
Yeah, and so just, like, kind of leave you with a few tidbits that I thought were interesting. One is which Madeleine L'Engle wrote this book, what she labels as a time of transition. Like, she and her family, this is when she was grown, of course, had been living in rural, you say Goshen, Connecticut?
That's how I would say it.
For several years, and they were moving back to New York City. So she wrote this book during that transition time. And, like, Michael and I were looking at the house that they lived in Connecticut was like a 200-year-old farmhouse. So we're wondering if the house that the Murrays live in was based off of that book.
Because they talk multiple times about how it's really old and, like, pre-Revolutionary War and stuff like that.
Which we thought was interesting. And then another thing, just another interesting tidbit, is there's, like, an interview with Madeleine L'Engle in the back of this book, and they ask what her favorite food is, and it's cream of wheat. So if that's not the most wholesome thing that you've ever heard, I don't know what is. So
I hope she flavors it.
I hope so too, but
it's not just like a plain cream of wheat.
Well, yeah. So anyway, good book.
That's A Wrinkle in Time. Yeah. So next time, when our next episode is going to be so this was book number 1 that we're doing. And then, like we said in the first episode, we're going to start going by decade through. And so we're going all the way to the beginning of the Newbery Awards and picking a book from the 1920s. And the book that we picked is the very first Newbery Award winner, or Newbery Medal winner, which is called The Story of Mankind, and is by, I'm going to remember this guy's, he's like Dutch.
Hendrik William van...
Yeah, it's Hendrik, like, Wilhelm van Loon or something like that.
Yes, that's it.
It is, I think, one of the only nonfiction books that has won the Newbery Medal. And it is very long, so
we're trucking
unlike
away.
A Wrinkle in Time, it is very long. It's like 500 pages, and it's literally like the history of mankind. So that will be the next book that we read. If you want to read along with us, you can read that very long and very antiquated book before you listen to the next podcast, because that's what we'll be talking about then. But if you don't want to read it, it's world history, so maybe you can just remember from high school or something.
Yeah, whatever interpretation of history that you were taught in high school.
Right. And also,
whatever interpretation we're reading in this book, I guess I should say.
And also, if you have thoughts about what we said about A Wrinkle in Time, we don't have an email. We don't have anything set up for this podcast. But I'm sure at the time that we're recording this, we've not actually, like, uploaded the podcast or anything like that. But I'm sure we'll have a social media presence. I'm sure at this point, it is mostly our parents listening to this. And so you guys can text us.
Yeah, just let us know.
But the rest of y'all, when after this podcast gathers acclaim and thousands of listeners, I'm sure in subsequent podcast episodes we'll have created some sort of something that you can give us feedback. But for now, the first real episode, where it's probably just friends and family listening to us, let us know what you think. Anyway, do you have any other thoughts before we sign off, Rebecca?
I don't.
Okay, well,
Talk to you later.
Thanks for listening. Bye.